So let's get started. So like I said, this is going to be a lot of the background on EC2, a lot of theoretical work, and understanding some of the compute types and pricing models is important. I'll point out to you the things that I think you should memorize or have easy to, ready at your fingertips. And then there's some stuff which you don't necessarily have to worry about memorizing. You can always look it up, but you have to have a good, understanding. So EC2, it stands for Elastic Cloud Compute, and it's a service. So you'll hear this about lots of AWS. Okay, they're called services, RDS, Relational Database Service. Lambda, it's a service. EC2, it's a service. So you remember we talked about in introductory to cloud computing, you have infrastructure as a service. So all of these things that AWS has are called services. So you get a server, but the EC2 category of things is called a service. So it's the EC2 service, which allows you to stand up, spin up, or create resizable compute capacity, right? And that's really important to understand that, this is the difference between cloud computing, EC2, cloud computing, AWS, and being on premise. I can stand up an EC2 instance that has 1 CPU and 2 gig of memory, and tomorrow I can change it to 2 CPU and 4 gig of memory. I don't have to know when I start it up what my needs are. That's why it's called elastic. It's one of the most important things for you to understand about EC2 because, for example, if you start working in the world of migrations, customers will say, well, right now on premise, I have this, and I think it's going to require, this much memory and this many people to connect to it. And you're like, that's fine. We can start wherever you want, but then we can go down, we can go up. It's very easy to do. And it's one of the key features of virtual machines in AWS. So EC2, Elastic Cloud Compute, it's a virtual machine. Again, let's rewind back a little bit to our initial class, which was on introductory to cloud computing, right? So I've got my hardware underneath, and then we put out hypervisor, right? Remember, we're virtualizing. We are creating segments or tenants. Remember, we talked about tenants. So each tenant, here they've called it a guest. So I've created multiple EC2 instances on one host server. So the underlying hardware, it's one big piece of hardware, but I split that hardware up and I get multiple tenants. So when I spin up an EC2 instance, I'm getting one of these virtual machines that's running on a piece of hardware. The way they split it up is going to be in a way that's optimized for cost and for operations for AWS. But theoretically, this can be any operating system. This can be any operating system, and the number of CPU and the amount of memory per instance can be different. Now, that's not exactly the way AWS does it, but theoretically, that can be the case. Okay, so I've used these terms interchangeably: device, computer, server, host. So these are all things that we've used to talk about when we're talking about routing and network. When we talk about EC2, these are instances, these are servers. So we'll talk about hosts, we'll talk about servers. Sometimes people will call them computers, but it's a server is really a high-power computer compared to what you might have as your desktop, right? And what does it include? It includes the operating system. It's going to include the memory. It's going to include the CPU. And then we talked about security groups a little bit during the last session, but it's essentially your host-based firewall. So you have what's called an AMI, or Amazon Machine Image, which has all the information about the operating system. You have the EBS volumes, which is your disk, your instance type, which is your CPU type, and then, of course, the number of CPUs, and then your security group. And that all together is your EC2 instance.